not bad.
That's 10.
Yeah, all of them on target.
Killed him.
Hey guys, welcome back to Triple F Shooting. Today we're going to look at a Chinese SKS, or at least a couple of them. We have a few different variants, but we are going to be focusing on the Chinese specifically. Now, to do that, we're still going to have to give just a little bit of brief history on kind of where it came from. Most people have heard the story and know about these things, so I'm just going to kind of gloss through it. If you would like a ton of information on these, there's always forgotten weapons. I think pretty much everyone understands that he knows more than everybody else. Go look him up. So, the original design for the SKS kind of left it dead on arrival. Was not a horrifically successful rifle compared to the AK-47 because it came out almost immediately after. This thing was designed in 1945. 2 years later, you have not the underfolder, but this design. So lots of things we can talk about in comparison that make it more useful and effective in combat. But designed in 1945 in Russia by Sergei Simonov. I am not even going to remotely attempt to pronounce what SKS stands for, but generally speaking it has his name in it, and then self-loading rifle if I am not mistaken. So, getting into the action is very clear. We'll even show that there's nothing in the magazine. And you can see that the magazine doesn't really come off the gun. So, let's get into some of the characteristics of the rifle that didn't do it any favors right when it came out. Now, a couple things it did really well was that it was chambered in an intermediate cartridge. So, toward the end of World War II, with rifles like the Sturmgewehr, intermediate cartridges were pretty quickly noticed that it's going to be kind of the new thing for combat, or at least eventually. So this rifle is chambered in an intermediate cartridge. You have a decent amount of firepower, but it is much more controllable than, say, a 30-06 or an 8mm Mauser round or a 7.62x54R, where you're really throwing some energy. A lot of the fighting is happening closer, so there's not maybe as much emphasis on World War I tactics where we're trying to punch holes in people at 600 yards. We're in urban, a lot of times under 100 yards. We need something that's controllable, does the job, but is much easier to shoot and suppress the enemy with. So good job, SKS. You're in an intermediate cartridge that would go on to be very successful in the AK. It's semi-auto. That's sort of helpful. But it's not select fire. So again, at the time, the ideas are starting to turn to, suppress the enemy, close distance, and do what you got to do with flanking and maneuvering. And when you are doing that, two things that are important is fire rate and ability to shoot controlled. Does okay. And ammo. This does not do okay in the ammo department. Anyone who has an SKS or has ever shot one knows that they run off of a 10-round stripper clip. So that means you will be reloading like this.
Oh my God.
That is obviously not as fast as reloading with a detachable box magazine, nor does it carry near the ammo capacity. So with the detachable box, I can carry lots of them with 30 rounds apiece, pop them into the gun and keep going. with an internal box magazine. I shoot my 10 rounds, gun stays open, cram another 10 in, go back to what I was doing, and that is just not as fast. There's going to be a lot more stopping and reloading with this rifle. Other than that major detractor, it's not the worst rifle you've ever seen or had. Many SKSs were built, millions of them. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese made the most of them, which is why most people that have an SKS have a Chinese one. Russian ones, I believe they quit making them sometime in the 50s, so it was a fairly short-lived rifle and pretty much immediately went to like ceremonial duty, things like that, parades, rear guard, that kind of thing. Still a useful rifle, just not as useful as an AK. Okay, so as you can tell, this thing is chonky and beat up. I really like this thing. I like to shoot it. I don't feel bad about shooting it. It is a mix-match numbers. The stock looks like it was used as a crowbar at some point, and it just kind of oozes. I've been used heavily and probably did things that, you know, things like combat stuff. So if you like that kind of thing, getting a junker, you know, kind of beat up SKS is not the worst thing ever. And it still shoots fairly decent. We ran this as just kind of a bonus run in that M16 versus AK-47 video. And it actually, other than having to reload it all the time, performed really well compared to the AK. So real quick, what we can do to show how obsolete this thing is kind of run through its features. So you do have a fairly short length of pull. A lot of people you'll see have to kind of roll their thumb around the right side of the stock to avoid, you know, thumbing themselves in the nose. The recoil on this is not substantial, but you see a lot of people kind of running their thumb around, and I think that's also for some help with accuracy in your trigger pull and stuff like that. I've always just run it, you know, thumb over, and the more you square up to the rifle, the less close your face is to the back of the receiver. But fairly short length of pull. The safety system is not terrible. You can definitely tell, like if you go to reach into the trigger guard, hey, my safety is on, so without seeing it, you can tell it's there. That flips down and out of the way. When it's in line with the rest of the trigger guard, you're good to go. As far as shooting, controls on the rifle are very simple. You pull back your charging handle that is directly attached to your bolt carrier, similar to an AK. Cram rounds into the magazine, pull back and let go. So running the rifle is pretty easy. The operation system is, while similar in look to an AK, where you can see that you do have a gas block and gas tube arrangement, you know, over the top of the barrel, that is very similar, although a lot sleeker than the AK, where it's way more obvious. This rifle isn't quite so bulky because it doesn't have a great big piston attached to my bolt carrier running all the way up to this point. It's allowing the gas to come back through and hit this much smaller, if you can see it, I'll probably throw in an actual picture, but hit that pin that is spring loaded, and it slaps your bolt carrier and drives it back, and that is just known as a short stroke piston system. A little bit more moving parts than on something like an AK, but still very, very reliable. I believe InRange did a video of this thing in the mud test, and it slightly outperformed an AK by like one whole round or something. So take that with a grain of salt, but that's how the gun works. Sights are basically the exact same thing as an AK, where you have the rear leaf graduated out to 1,000 meters, and I have a slide to get me all those different ranges, but I just have a standard notch looking up at a hooded front post. Now, as far as I know, all the SKSs I've ever seen have a hooded front post. There are none that have kind of the wings only, similar to an AK. So that's both. It's just kind of preference. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, well, you don't. But it does protect that post. Believe on the Chinese variants, the bores are chrome lined, and that's something that most of the Russian rifles do not have, if I'm not mistaken. So chrome lining is a good thing, especially since a lot of these we're seeing corrosive ammunition. Even though this one's all beat up, the bore is not terrible. And everybody has probably noticed that they do have an attached swing out bayonet.
Here, hold on.
So you don't have to carry your bayonet on your hip. It's already on the rifle all the time. That's both good and bad because a bayonet can also be a utility piece, you know, for cutting things in a knife form rather than just stab on the end of my, you know, now 4-foot spear. This is a later model having that spiked bayonet. The earlier models had a blade style. The cleaning rod is attached to the gun. I did not mention that the cleaning kit is very similarly to an AK inside the buttstock and looks very, very similar. It's just a little, you know, capsule holding all your different brushes and tools. And then the barrel ends off with no ability for any kind of muzzle device because your bayonet mount comes around and has like a bevel so it can start over the barrel and it actually locks over the barrel on a Chinese variant anyway. That 20-inch barrel is going to push the AK round with a little bit more speed. It's substantial. I don't know if it's enough to make an enormous difference in impact, but I think you're gaining a couple hundred feet per second, somewhere around there. As far as firing the gun, the recoil is pretty light. Many people, especially, you know, in the 80s, 90s, took deer with this gun. I know quite a few people that were, when you know, younger, this was their first deer rifle because there's very little kick. You are ballistically just a hair less than like a 30-30, so very capable on a deer, 200 yards and in. Because you're dealing with iron sights, you're, especially as a kid, you're probably shooting at a whole lot less than that. I actually had the opportunity to take a deer with my commercial production SKS by Norinco a few years ago, and it worked real well. It was also a great scenario for an SKS because the deer was only at about 25 yards on the move in a drive sort of situation, and pulled the gun up. Front hood was on the deer, focused in on the sight, hit the trigger, everything went really well. One shot kill, very clean, so functioned very well. Was also using Remington core locked, you know, cheap, basic deer hunting ammo, and that round did just fine. I guess we could leave that thing up here, but as you can see, this thing is the military surplus. It's Triangle 26 rifle. It's beat to crap. There are tons and tons of rifles out there. A lot of people have a Norinco, you know, excuse me, commercial built rifle, so it's going to look a whole lot nicer on the stock. Has a little bit better finish on it because it's never been in a mud pit or anything like that. But no problems with this rifle. You can see that this one has its bayonet attached with an actual like Allen head, socket head type bolt and nut. It is not the correct setup for the bayonet. It should not be sticking out like that, but that's what's on it when I bought it. But there are tons of variants of SKS. If you know much about the Russians, anybody that was a friend of theirs or within that Soviet bloc, you got whatever kind of guns and tech that they were dealing with, and they were usually pretty helpful about it. There are Sino-Soviet Chinese rifles that were built under the supervision of advisors and things. Those are a lot more rare and command a much higher price. But so not only are Chinese rifles made, but Russian, Albanian, Romanian, I think Polish, North Korean, Vietnamese, probably missing others. They've been used by Egypt, lots and lots of them in the Middle East, as well as, you know, the Vietnam theater and everything else. So they are ubiquitous, to say the least. There are millions of them produced. Another really interesting variant that we're lucky enough to have our hands on at the moment. As you can see, it has a Serbian sex toy on it. I do not claim that name. I heard it from a viewer, and I think it's my favorite name for a practice rifle grenade that I've ever heard. This is just a dummy grenade that we shot off of the Yugo AK.
Ready?
Ready.
3, 2, 1. Holy
But the Yugoslavian, this is a 59-66, so their first variant was much more similar to the Chinese. This variant has a whole bunch of upgrades. We'll talk about it more when we do the video on it and probably shoot that grenade off of it. But one really neat thing, as you can tell, has the permanently affixed grenade spigot. You move that little button over. Now I have grenade sight, and I have changed my gas block to send all of the energy out the barrel and fire this big old honker. So these are really neat. We'll get more into that. It even has night sights on it, which is sort of interesting. Oh, while we're at it, if you're wondering what the blade bayonet looks like, something like that. I think these are a little longer than the Chinese ones, but you also have to get out past that spigot, and they also lock up differently because they do not go around the barrel. They just sort of have a lug that interfaces with that grenade ring to keep it locked in place. But very cool rifle. We were lucky enough to borrow that guy and hopefully get to shoot it soon. Okay, so main question for lots of people looking at something like this. Why in God's name would you buy one in today's market? That answer is way more limited than it used to be. These things have crawled up and up and up in price. I was lucky enough, I'm not lucky enough to be like the 80s, early 90s kid that bought it when it was like $80 with a case of ammo or anything like that. Those days are way gone. But you do get to hear lots of people talk about the glory days with the SKS. I guess we were lucky in some regard. I could buy a Mosin Nagant for like $70 and a case of 440 rounds for like 60 or 70 bucks. Back when I was able to buy, when first able to buy rifles. So I did have my own version of that, just not an SKS. So why buy this thing right now? They used to be excellent utility rifles. They're reliable. They will work in fairly harsh conditions, so people use them as like their survival rifle. A lot of people, as you'll hear it called, Bubba the rifle up. They would put different stocks on it. They would add these atrocious removable magazines and try to make it into an AK, even though it's not even close, in that regard anyway. They would do all sorts of crazy things, put terrible scope mounts on them that wouldn't hold zero, and just, lots of unsightly crap. Not something you're going to see a whole lot more of anymore because they're too expensive for that, and that's not something you want to chop into. So with them creeping up for a Chinese one anywhere from $400 to $600, sometimes even $700, the more rare they get, the higher the price. So the Yugos are a little more expensive than that. The Russians are into the $1,000 if you're going for like an Albanian or Romanian one that are really rare. Sometimes they're even more than that. So they're not cheap. There's not a lot of value here anymore, other than if you just like to collect this sort of thing. And I do. But again, I got to buy them before they were crazy expensive. I think this one, if I remember correctly, was still when you can buy them for like, and it's rough, it's pretty beat up in mixed match numbers, but it was probably like $200, somewhere around there, from Palmetto, and it came packed in just nasty, nasty Cosmoline. That commercial one that I had earlier was a trade when I was first getting into guns. The value of that was probably $300, something like that at the time. Now you're talking $500-600 pretty easily for a good shaped Chinese SKS. So unless you just like to collect them, a lot of that base value that they used to have is sort of out the window. They're not as good as an AK, so a lot of that utility, even though it's still there for basic stuff, not really something I'd go for a defensive rifle, unless you're in one of the awful states that restrict you to a non-scary gun. This still works real well. It's not scary. It doesn't have a muzzle device. It doesn't have a pistol grip. It doesn't have a detachable magazine. It's wood. That usually helps your just overall appearance and the scare factor. So still something viable for that, and you still have a potent, fairly easy to get round. They're getting harder to get because of all the bands, but that's an option. Otherwise, they used to make really good, inexpensive first deer guns that work well. They used to be great utility rifles. Like I said, all the survivalist dudes and the Bubbas loved them. But anymore, I wouldn't buy this and throw it in my truck for, you know, defensive truck purposes, because for, you know, sometimes the same price if it's a Chinese one, or like half the price if it's a Russian, you can get, you know, a decent AR, put a dot on it and a light, and be quite a bit cheaper and way more modular and way more modern, and lots more options for configuration and all that good stuff for a lot less money, or at least the same money as an SKS. So if I didn't have one, would I run out and buy one? Yeah, probably. But that's only because I have the bias, because I have owned one. I love shooting these things. I get them out fairly regularly over a lot of other guns. In some cases, I'd rather shoot this than an AK, just because I think the reloading's really fun, and just making an older style gun that isn't great work in a more modern drill. I enjoy that kind of crap. I like all the old cowboy guns because it's just a completely different field of shooting, and that's kind of where this lands for me. So should you go get an SKS if you don't have one? If you have the money and you like the military surplus kind of thing, absolutely. If you don't, pass. Go buy another AR or something like that. It's a little more practical for you. I'm dying. Anyway, hope you enjoyed. I'm still dying. Hope you enjoyed looking at a goofball holding a rifle and talking about it and running around shooting it. But that's all I got for you today on the SKS. Look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks for watching Triple F Shooting.
Okay, one thing to be very aware of with an SKS is it can hand fire, meaning when you let go of the bolt, you need it aiming in a safe direction, because otherwise it can like machine gun and go off because of the way the firing pin is arranged inside the thing. So aim it in safe direction. Nobody died. Neat. Let's get going.